Okay, so let's go ahead and get started so we can get to our presentation. My name is Tiffany Holmes, and I am the founding president of the Reading League Tennessee. And you um, are going to be part of our third session of our Who Do You Recommend series. I'm going to go ahead and tell you a little bit about Dr. Ehri, and then we will get started. Linnea Ehri, PhD, is Distinguished Professor Emerita of Educational Psychology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She has received research awards from professional organizations including ERA, Triple SR, ILA, LDA, AIM, and NLA. She was president of the Society for the Scientific Study of Reading. She is a member of the Reading Hall of Fame. She served on the National Reading Panel, which was commissioned by the U.S. Congress to report on research-based methods of teaching reading effectively to elementary students. She has published over 160 papers in professional journals and books. Her research has provided scientific evidence clarifying automatic word reading processes through orthographic mapping, developmental phases portraying how children acquire word reading and spelling skill, and instruction to facilitate acquisition of these processes. So, Dr. Ehri's recommendation tonight is Sue Hegland. Dr. Ehri, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. Welcome.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to welcome everyone, and I thank you for your interest in this presentation. And thank you, Tiffany, for the very kind introduction. I'm grateful to Tiffany and the Tennessee Reading League for inviting me to host this webinar on a topic dear to my heart: how students learn to read and spell words. Sue Hegland is an educator and frequent speaker on topics related to spelling. She began her career doing research and instructional design, but her focus shifted in 2003 when she learned that one of her children is dyslexic. Trained in the Orton-Gillingham approach to literacy instruction, she has been studying and teaching about orthographic linguistics since 2014. She's been active in the International Dyslexia Association and on the Board of Education of her local school district. She's the founder of the website learningaboutspelling.com. Next slide. I got to know Sue at the International Dyslexia Association conference last year when she told me about her book, and she sent me a copy. It's titled Beneath the Surface of Words: What English Spelling Reveals and Why It Matters. I found her insights about connections between spellings and meanings fascinating, how parts of the spellings of multisyllabic words can be analyzed semantically to uncover their contribution to the meanings of words. These parts, called morphographs, consist of spellings of base elements and affixes that systematically combine to represent not only pronunciations, but also meanings of words. In my research, I focused on how readers learn to read words automatically by sight and to remember spellings of words. The learning process is called orthographic mapping, where spellings become glued to pronunciations in memory. The glue consists of knowledge of the writing system, how graphemes represent phonemes, and how syllables and morphemes represent larger units of speech. After reading Sue's book, I realized that orthographic mapping can also apply to the process of connecting spellings to the meanings of words. The glue consists of morphographs that systematically represent the meanings of base elements and affixes within the spellings of words. If readers learn how this morphographic spelling system works, and if they detect and connect these morphographic spelling units to the meanings of individual words when they learn them, their memory for the words will be enriched, and they should acquire new sight words faster and more effectively. So when I was asked to nominate a presenter for the Tennessee Reading League, I thought of Sue. Her presentation would provide an opportunity to share her insights about the morphographic writing system with teachers so that they might apply it in their reading, spelling, and vocabulary instruction. As a result, their students' memory for sight words might be strengthened and help them become better readers and spellers. For me, this was an exciting possibility to enhance teachers' curiosity and interest in analyzing the morphemic structure of word spellings and see its application to instruction. Next slide. I've listed some central concepts that you should learn about in Sue's presentation. Morphemes are the minimal units of meanings in words. Morphemic spellings refer to semantic or syntactic subunits in words. Morphemic families are groups of related words that share a semantic base element. Affixes are attachments that modify the meaning of the base element. Two important tools are used to analyze the morphographic structure of words: word sums and word matrices. Etymology traces words to their root meanings. With that introduction, I turn the presentation over to Sue and thank her for her willingness to tell you about her work on morphology and spelling.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ehri, for that introduction. Thank you for nominating me to give this talk. And I'm going to echo your thanks to the Reading League Tennessee chapter for hosting this series. I think this is really an interesting concept. And thank you to all of you who are here with us tonight for this talk on orthographic morphology. So just to give you a little heads up, tonight I'm going to be showing you a lot of word matrices, which Dr. Ehri just mentioned, and I will be sharing a PDF with you that will have all of those matrices, all the ones I show tonight, so you don't need to take screenshots or worry about, scribbling those down. You'll get that PDF when you get the link to the recording. And secondly, my plan is to talk tonight for about an hour and 15 minutes, and then we'll turn it back over to Dr. Ehri for a few comments. And as you heard, we're not going to answer questions tonight, partly because it's a large audience, but also because of time. But they'll be collecting the questions you type in during the talk and share those with us. And then I'll share my email at the end. And Dr. Ehri is going to be sharing her email as well in case you have any questions for her. So the challenge as I get started on this talk is always, how do I keep my talks short? Because there are so many aspects of morphology and other aspects of spelling as well that are so useful for teachers to know about. And I always want to share everything I've learned, and I'm going to try to rein that in a little bit tonight and hope that we get a chance to talk again. So what I'm going to highlight in this talk is some of the most systematic aspects of morphology that are relevant as we think about what we can do in instruction to support this process of orthographic mapping. So we'll start off with some terminology. I'll go over a couple of essential tools for working with morphology, which Dr. Ehri has alluded to, and I'll be highlighting a number of key concepts with lots of examples as we go along. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be discussing how all of this might fit into instruction, and I will end with some specific instructional implications. And now my work is mostly about building teacher knowledge about the writing system, but of course, the ultimate purpose is how do we support children in the classroom and the tutoring setting and anywhere else that we are able to help them with literacy. So morphology is the system of structural units called morphemes that form words in very systematic ways. And we can use this term orthographic morphology to talk about the morphological system as it appears in written words. And one of the things I hope to do tonight is give you a sense of the very systematic nature of written morphology and why it should be part of our thinking for instruction from the very beginning. So I've got a few examples here of written morphemes inside the angle brackets in the box that you see. We use angle brackets to show that what's inside those brackets is a written form rather than something spoken. And you can see here that the elements PLAY and STRUCT are called base elements. They form the core of a written word, and along with the prefixes and suffixes, they will form the words that you can see right here, replaying and deconstructed. And I should mention that many times people use the term roots or combining forms. Roots if base comes from Latin, combining forms if they come from Greek. I'm going to just talk about any core morpheme in a word as a base element. tonight. So morphemes are often defined as the smallest meaningful unit of language, and they are found in both spoken and written words. And this is a typical definition for a morpheme from language files, which defines a morpheme as the smallest linguistic unit with a meaning or a grammatical function. But as we think about morphemes tonight, I want you to keep in mind that they are actually conceptual or abstract. The idea of a morpheme is a way of thinking about subunits in words. But there isn't universal agreement, even among linguists, about whether particular subunits in words are morphemic or not. So for me, the question, and I suspect this is the question for you too, the question is, how do we analyze written words in particular into subunits in ways that will support literacy growth? And so with that in mind, I'm going to tweak that definition of a morpheme a little bit and say that written morphemic units may contribute to the meaning of a word, but they don't necessarily have a meaning in the same way that a word does. And this view of written morphology opens up so much understanding about our spelling system. And I'm going to use this term element to refer to the written form of a morpheme. Dr. Ehri used the term morphograph. And for what we're talking about tonight, we can think of those two words as synonyms. So let's talk about the contribution to meaning that a written morpheme makes. And we'll do that as we look at one of those essential tools that Dr. Ehri mentioned that allows us to see what's going on in the morphology of written language, a word matrix. And many of you have seen these matrices around, but I'm just going to walk you through this. A word matrix has a base element in the central banner, and every word has at least one base element as its core. This particular base, DRAW, is a free base. That means that it forms a word all by itself. Obviously, it forms the word draw. But there are differences between a base element, even a free base like this one, and a word. They're not the same thing. A word has one or more specific meanings, definitions, and usages. If we think about the word draw, for instance, everyone knows what that word means, right? Even a young child, unless they're maybe a multilingual learner, will typically know what it means to draw when they come to school. So once a student, even a brand new young student, can use that word in a sentence, I like to draw pictures, then we have to teach them how to read and spell the word, right? And in the case of the word draw, then children have to learn to identify the phonemes, d, ah, and that last symbol is the IPA symbol, the International Phonetic Association symbol for that ah pronunciation. And the slash brackets around those symbols, by the way, indicate that what's inside them is representing phonemes, not letters, not graphemes. That's not the letter D, that's a representation of D. And of course, children then need to learn that the graphemes D, R, and AW represent those phonemes in the spelling of that word. And then once a student knows all of that, they're good to go for reading and comprehension, right? But then they run into this usage of the word, draw the curtains. And here Amelia Bedelia is drawing the curtains. This whole book series is based on the confusions that can result when children, or any of us really, are thinking of only one meaning or usage of a word. And for the word draw, that's not the only usage that might be confusing. So we talk about drawing a bath, we talk about drawing money out of the bank, we talk about drawing names from a hat, drawing criticism. And I was obviously setting you up with my example here, right? Because we all know that we need to teach children multiple meanings of words, but sometimes it doesn't even dawn on us how many different meanings there are, how many different usages, and how they might impact comprehension. So how do we teach multiple meanings efficiently? If you're a young child in particular, if we look at all these different ways that we use the word draw, they might seem totally disconnected, right? What does drawing names from a hat have to do with drawing a picture? So this is the first way in which thinking about the morphology of written language in perhaps slightly different ways than we're used to thinking about the morphology of spoken language can be really powerful, and it can unlock multiple meanings in really efficient ways, because words have definitions and usages, as we know. But a morphological base element has something called an orthographic denotation. Now, that is not a specific meaning like the meaning of a word. It's a deeper sense that a base element contributes to all the words that are formed from that base. And so for the base DRAW, its orthographic denotation is drag or pull. So think about how that idea of dragging or pulling connects to the idea of drawing the curtains or drawing names from a hat. And some of those connections are more metaphorical, like drawing criticism, right? But with this orthographic denotation in mind, then, can you think of a way that the usage of the word draw for drawing a picture might have come about? And how we can connect it even now to this idea of dragging or pulling? And I'm betting it's starting to click for you, right? We put the tip of our writing instrument on our paper and we drag it from one place to another to draw a picture. That's obviously not the definition of how we use the word draw a picture. It's not to drag in general, but you can see that connection. So that orthographic denotation of a base is a powerful tool for working with students on vocabulary. And now I understand that might sound intriguing, but how do we find this deep sense, this nugget of meaning? How did I come up with this orthographic denotation of drag or pull to share with you today for this base DRAW? Well, we use etymology as a research tool to do that. So in this entry from etymonline.com, and many of you may know about that fantastic website, we learn that the word draw was first found in an English text that dates from around 1200. And we see that at that time, what it meant was to give motion to something by the act of pulling. And it was spelled, instead of DRAW, it was spelled DRAUEN. And this spelling was formed from the Old English word spelled DRAGAN that meant to drag, to draw, to protect, protract. And the usage of this word has shifted and expanded over time, which is how language works. And the entry here will continue on, and you can go to Etymonline later if you want to see the explanations for how all of these various multiple meanings have developed. But what I want to focus on for the purposes of morphological analysis is this original sense from the oldest written etymon that we have. And in this case, it's this Old English word that we see in the red box. This is where we get important clues about the orthographic denotation, the deep sense of the base as it's functioning in English today. So what you see here is drag, draw, protract. And I've modified that a little bit and used drag and pull for the orthographic denotation. That's what you find below the base element in the central banner of a matrix. And I've factored in the meaning and history of other words that derive from this base because that drag pull seems to me to capture the overall sense of this base as it's functioning in English today. But other people might use slightly different words for their understanding of the orthographic denotation. And the words I use and other people use may change as we learn more about the morphological family of words that are formed from this base. So working with this deep sense present in a base is going to facilitate learning and remembering multiple meanings of words formed from the base, as well as the meaning of words that are derived from that base, might have, prefixes, suffixes, compound words, and so on. Now, again, that orthographic denotation is part of the present day morphological system of written English. But to find it, we typically go to etymological references, and they help us discern how that base is functioning in English. So etymology is an incredibly important research tool that helps us make sense of the morphology of written words as they exist in English today. So now I've expanded this matrix to include a prefix RE to the left and some suffixes to the right. And in this particular matrix, you will find some additional base elements that are printed in bold font. And those additional base elements allow us to find compounds. So what words do you see as you look at this matrix? And you've had a minute or two to look at it. So you might have first noticed some compounds, including overdraw and drawback. And as you look at the suffixes, you can see the elements that build words like drawing, redraw, and drawn. And that word drawn, of course, is the past participle form of the verb to draw. We draw some conclusions, we've drawn them. And that N suffix is not a productive suffix in English. That means that we don't form new past participles from verbs using this suffix, but it's found in some verbs that have been part of English for a very long time, like this one. So we can analyze that as an existing suffix in English. It's just that we don't make new words with it. So these word sums then that you're seeing here on this slide are the second essential tool for working with morphology. Word sums and matrices work together. A matrix provides a static view of a family of words that share a base, and the word sum shows the structures and the processes that are involved in the formation of words from morphemic elements. So let's look at one more word. So what is this word? What does it mean? How is it used? How do you pronounce it? So I see this word and I think drawer, the drawer in my desk, right? And until now, you may not have thought that this word could be morphologically complex, but I've hopefully set you up to see the structure of this word by showing you this matrix earlier. And this is the morphological structure of this written word. It is built from the base DRAW and a suffix ER. Now, I had never noticed the structure of this word before I started learning from many other people about how to understand written morphology in this way. I thought of the word drawer as a whole, as one unit of meaning, and that is certainly a legitimate way to view the word. You will actually find that most linguists define a spoken word like drawer as a single morphemic unit. But it is so powerful for our work in literacy to recognize that the written word drawer does have these subunits, the base DRAW and the suffix ER. But then what is that ER doing there then? And how does a drawer connect to drawing or pulling? So you probably know that there are several ER suffixes in English, and one of them is called an agent suffix. It forms words meaning someone or something that does a particular action. So a farmer is someone who farms, a mower is something that mows, an owner is someone who owns something. And this ER suffix can function in this word in the same way, depending on the usage of the word. So are we saying that a drawer then is something that drags or pulls? That doesn't really make sense, right? So we turn to etymology once again to get some clues about what's going on. And we find at Etymonline that when this word first came into English, it meant one who draws water from a well, one who pulls, drags, or transports. If you're hearing that, hopefully you're not hearing a plane behind me that I'm hearing. It's an agent noun from draw. It was an agent noun for draw. It was also formerly a waiter or bartender. And you may have heard a bartender talk about pulling a pint of beer, right? Especially if you've traveled in the UK. But by the 1570s, this word was being used for a box-shaped receptacle that can be drawn or pulled out of a cabinet or a dresser by sliding it, right? So we know that when you open a drawer, the drawer is not what is doing the acting. It's actually being acted upon. So the usage of the word and the function of the suffix has changed in this word. The word went from describing the agent of action to the recipient of action. Again, depending on usage, because we'll come back to that. But we can understand that connection, right? That a drawer is called a drawer because we draw it or pull it out. And that helps with the spelling, obviously, as well as understanding, most kids will know what a drawer is, but they're going to have a hard time spelling it if they try to just sound it out. So what we're seeing is a connection between the spelling of this word and its meaning and usage. Note that we do not get that connection from pronunciation alone, and we can't just add up the meanings. We can't just take the meaning of the base and take what we think the meaning of the suffix is and put those together and get the definition of the word, but we can see how they connect. We can understand how that we've gotten there. So it's important to recognize that pronunciation alone here does not give us as much information about the identity of the word as we get from analyzing the morphology embedded in the spelling. Now, there are a couple additional usages of this word, and if you have students who are fans of Captain Underpants, they will run into this use of drawers, right? And again, these drawers are being acted upon. They're being pulled up as we pull them on, but now we understand why they're called drawers, right? And then look at this third usage, a person who produces a drawing or design. A young child might look at the word spelled D-R-A-W-E-R and read it as drawer. My friend is a really good drawer. And we might think, I know that's so sweet. That's so kindergartenish, but it's not really how we pronounce or use that word in English. But in fact, drawer is one pronunciation, and that is a usage. We can talk about the banker would have rights as holder to pursue the drawer. So again, not a very common usage, but my understanding, I've been studying this now for more than a decade. My own understanding of the usage of words has expanded every time I look at a familiar word in this way. And I have a fairly extensive vocabulary already. I'm sure you do too. So every student at every level can learn from this kind of study. Now, I want to give you one more example of how helpful this orthographic denotation can be, even with very young students and very simple words that we might think, they're pretty obvious. Morphology doesn't come into play with a word like jam, right? I was working with a first grader. This was a year or so ago, and she came across the word jam. We were working on Zoom actually, and I don't know why I felt like I needed to ask her if she knew what it meant, but I did, and she said sure, and she started snapping her fingers and swaying, and she was jamming. And I was thinking of something to put on my toast, and she was thinking about dancing. So we also talk about traffic jams and jamming something into a suitcase. So when my student came up with this different usage than the one that I had in my head, I started to wonder how all of these were connected, and again, turned to etymology to understand that. So when this word was found in a written text from 1719, it was used to mean press tightly. And before that, in a text from 1706, it meant to become wedged. And there's more to the entry, but that's as far back as etymologists are confident of the history. And really, that's all we need. There's obviously this connection between the idea of pressing tightly or becoming wedged and several of the usages of this word, right? Traffic jams, jamming into a suitcase. We totally get that. You have to think about fruit jam a little bit. But if you've made jam, you've probably, pressed the fruit together to break it up as the jam cooked. And so we can create that connection to that usage and this deep sense. But then what about jam sessions? Well, there we have to go and look at the history a little bit. And the historians who think about words have a couple of theories. One is that the music played in early jazz jam sessions was sweet, like the jam on our toast. But the other is that they might have been called jam sessions because people would crowd into a room to hear them. They would press tightly together to listen to the music. Now, we're not sure how this word evolved, but we don't even have to be sure to create personal, memorable connections between all the usages of this word by thinking about what makes sense to us. When I shared this history with Dr. Ehri, she said, oh, that's really interesting. And then the musicians and the music they create are kind of pressed together as well in a jam session. So we can strengthen the connection between the spelling of words and their meanings using this orthographic denotation in many different ways. So you've looked at the matrix, you've seen the word sum in action, but now I want to show you the third essential tool for morphological understanding, and that is the three suffixing conventions that we use over and over again as we form written words in English. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with these, but we have an E convention, where we replace a final unpronounced E before adding vowel suffixes. And what you're seeing here is called a synthetic word sum. It shows how we synthesize or spell the word on the right side using the structures and processes that we see on the left. And the slash mark in that word sum is a reminder that when we write the completed word, we replace or drop that E that comes before the slash. If you're writing a word sum on paper, you can just put a slash right through that E. And that process and doing that is a great reminder for students that they will leave off the E when they write the final word. We also have a wide I convention that we apply under certain circumstances. And here I'm showing that change or toggle from a Y to I with that slash mark and the small I. And we have a doubling convention. And you can see how I've indicated that doubling process here. So there are different names that people use for these conventions, and there are conditions for applying all of them, but we won't go into that detail. Most of you know these inside and out, but they operate very consistently in our system. And knowing these conventions helps students learn to spell tens of thousands of words accurately. The more we learn about morphology, the more we see how consistent and powerful these conventions are. And all students should learn them and become fluent with them as soon as they are ready. And we're used to thinking about suffix and conventions as helpful for spelling, which of course they are, but word sums are also important as students encounter and attempt to read and learn new words. These are analytic word sums on this slide. And in an analytic word sum, we show the completed word on the left side, and then the right shows how we can analyze the word into smaller units. And some of what you see on the right side of these word sums could be analyzed further. The word study, the word revise, those could be analyzed further. But I want to emphasize how knowing the suffixing conventions and applying even a partial analysis of a word, whether it's on paper or just mentally in your head, it may allow us to see a connection to a familiar word, which helps support comprehension. Because a reader may run into the word revision and not know it, but they might know the word revise. And if they're used to seeing that ION suffix, they can kind of mentally remove the ION and say, oh, I wonder if I put that E back on, if that would be revise. I wonder if that word is related to this word I know to revise my work. Most students don't know the word studious, or they may, but they certainly will know study. And so those connections can be helpful if students use these word sums or these conventions and recognize how to use them to kind of look inside words. It goes the other way as well. Rather than going from a big word to a small one, students might know the longer word, like negative, but then not know negate. That's a little bit higher register word. But if a student is used to thinking like this structurally, they might see negative and notice the connection in spelling, or see negate, excuse me, and notice the connection in spelling to negative, and maybe be able to get a sense of what that word is about. I also want to point out that this works when you're focusing on the spelling and the consistent application of the conventions rather than trying to focus only on how would I pronounce that word. Because in fact, the pronunciation will sometimes obscure those connections, right? Study, studious, revise, revision. The pronunciation, we might not even realize those words are structurally connected, but the spelling shows it very clearly. So these words are also going to be very important for comprehension as we encounter both familiar and unfamiliar words. So the last essential tool then is etymological references. And if you find these examples that I'm giving tonight intriguing, there are lots of ways to learn how to do this type of analysis yourself. Like all skills, it takes time, it takes some practice, and ideally you get some good coaching to learn how to do this. But I want to give you a sense of how we use etymological research combined with morphological analysis to identify and validate the structures of words ourselves and to find morphological families of words that share a base. So when I showed you this word sum, you may have wondered about this. Is that really a suffix on that word? Is really a suffix AL? How do we know that? So let's take a look at the etymology. This word trial was first used in English to mean an examination before a court to determine guilt or innocence. That's one of the ways we still use that word trial. And it came into English from an Anglo-French noun that was spelled the same way we spell trial now in English. And that noun came from an Old French verb, which meant to try, to pick out, to cull. And the history before that is not clear. Etymologists think that there may have been another ancestor, this word here, but that little asterisk before it means that it is a reconstructed likely word. It's likely a word, but it wasn't actually found anywhere in written form. That's one way that we can use an asterisk when we're doing word study. I'll tell you another one later. And the entry goes on, but what we're looking for is right here. This is as far back as we can take the etymology, and we can see that this is the oldest ancestor that we have written evidence for, and we see its meaning. So this will help us think about a possible orthographic denotation for the base that forms the word trial. But we also have to figure out if that word trial has a base, TRY or TRI, or is it a base by itself? So one of the ways we do that is to look for other words that go back to the same etymon and may have the same base with the same orthographic denotation. They may be formed from that same base. One way to do that is to take the etymon that we find, the one we found for the word trial, the ancestor, and type that into the search box on etymonline.com. And we did that here. I did that TRIER. I came up with 5 entries that include that spelling somewhere in the entry. Now, then we have to think about, even though that spelling is in the entry, is it telling us that we found a word that goes back to the same ancestor? And the first word that comes up is the spelling of a city in Germany, named for the indigenous people, the Treveri. I'm not sure if that's the right pronunciation, actually, probably because it's German, that's not the right pronunciation, but that is certainly not the etymon we're looking for. The other thing that comes up is in this word obscene, we get the basic guidelines for the trier of fact. So clearly, just because the spelling is in an entry doesn't mean we've found a related word. But we do find 3 words that share this base. The other 3 that are listed, we already looked at trial, and if we look at try, that actually goes back to the same etymon. So, okay, try and trial probably share a base. They have the same etymon. We're going to make sure that that works, but that's a possibility. And then the other one that came up is triage, which I was really surprised to see. I've actually worked with try and trial for a long time, but I'd never realized that triage was connected. But it also goes back to this same Old French etymon that had this idea of picking or culling. And you could think about that. If you're sitting in an emergency room and you're doing triage, you need to pick out which patients need help first. So again, we can't just add up the meanings and get add up the meanings of the morphemes and get the definition of the word, but we can see that thread, we can see that connection. So looking at these 3 entries, I'm going to use try and pick out as what I think is the words for the orthographic denotation for that base that forms them. And now I have to figure out if these words all share a common spelling of a base. And here's where we use the analytic word sum and the application of suffixing conventions. So I'm wondering if these analyses will work. We've seen a possible AL suffix on the word trial. We know English has an AGE suffix, often in words that come from French, like manage, garage, courage. So that seems like a reasonable possibility. Certainly we have an AGE suffix in English doing much the same job. And we can use the Y to I convention to show how the base could be spelled TRY in all of these words. And then when we apply that convention, we get the spelling of the final word. So these words can be reasonably analyzed as having the same orthographic denotation of the base with that evidence from the shared etymon and the same spelling of the base, which with this convention applied and plausible suffixes. And so with that evidence, we can put these words into a matrix together. And I should mention that any matrix you create or you see that someone else has created is always provisional. It's always reflecting the best understanding of the written structures of the word that the person who analyzed those words had at the time that they made the matrix. And for all of us, our understanding is always growing and changing. So if you start to create matrices, as I hope you do, you want to do your best to make sure you have solid evidence for whatever you propose and then change those matrices as needed as you learn more. I do that all the time. Now, we might notice a word like tripod and wonder if this could go in the matrix too. We could certainly analyze it as having a similar structure, a TRI and then a POD. Looks like it could be a morphemic element, but we would have to show that it has the same orthographic denotation. That typically means that we can find the same etymon in its history. Now, I'm not going to show you the etymology of tripod because I think you probably already know that it would show us that this TRI in tripod has a sense of 3, right? We think of tripod, triangle, tricycle. That is coming from a different place. It has a different orthographic denotation, different origin. And so it doesn't go back to the same ancestor, and so we can't place it in the matrix. You may notice, by the way, that as I talk to you about morphology, I'm spelling out these elements. The TRY base shows up as TRI in some of the words, and I always try to spell elements as I talk about them. And I encourage you to develop this practice when you're dealing with written morphology. Just this week, as I mentioned, I was finishing this talk, I discovered that triage is related to trial, and it had never dawned on me. And why do you suppose I was so surprised, right? Because the pronunciation of the base is so different in the two words. There's no pronunciation try in the spoken word triage as there is in trial. At least trial, I'm like, I can hear the connection, but in triage, I can't. But the spelling there shows us that the connection. So we want to be thinking about the fact that sometimes we can see more in the written form than we can in the pronunciation. So when we name a base, then, by the way, we want to spell it, because if we're going to use the pronunciation, would we call the base in triage tree and we'd call the base in trial try? That gets very confusing. If we want to be consistent, we're going to spell the base. So now I have a few words that I've verified by etymology, and I can add some that we know are connected by compounding or by suffixing, like try out and trying. And we can also add tried and tries. And I can expand the matrix then to include these new words. Now, sometimes words like tries and tried, as well as words like says, are taught as though they are morphologically simple, made up of only a single morphemic element, a single base element, when in fact, they are morphologically complex. They are made up of more than one element. That's what it means when we say they're morphologically complex. Doesn't mean they're a hard word or an advanced word. It just means they have more than one element that forms it. So why do you suppose we teach these words as though they're one thing? I think part of the reason is we're used to just thinking about them as whole words. We learned them so long ago. And of course, once we orthographically map a word, we see it and we process it as a whole. But in addition, there's a question that sometimes arises as to whether it's just simpler to teach the children to spell these as whole words, because we can certainly do that. I'm sure many of you are very successful at doing that. But if our goal is to help students understand the system and be able to learn new words by using these consolidated morphemic units that repeat throughout the system, then it's important to show students the morphology of even words like these, because it shows them how things actually work. And in the case of says, it's going to help them spell it. For instance, these three words all have the same grammatical role. So as we think about showing children the system, we can say these three words are all third person form of a verb. And in the spelling, to signal that syntactic function to the reader, they all use what is essentially the same suffix with two different forms, two different spellings, S and ES. Now, suffix S is the default spelling for this suffix. Default meaning that we use S unless we have a reason to use ES. And in all the words that you see here on the slide so far, that S is pronounced Z, hugs, plays, etc. But on the right, I'm going to show you some here on the right, we see the same suffix S, but now it's pronounced S. So that is not surprising to any of you, I'm sure, right? You teach that to your children. You teach them that in the case of the suffix S, that element can be pronounced differently, but its spelling will stay the same. But this is a fact of our writing system that shows up everywhere. Morphemic elements are often pronounced differently in the various words in which they appear, while their spelling stays the same. So we saw this already with revise, revision, study, studious, draw, drawer, trial, triage. And because we have these shifts in pronunciation, we might think, oh my gosh, that's so confusing. That makes our system more confusing. But that's only if we assume that pronunciation is supposed to be able to translate directly into spelling. In fact, the spelling system has these consistent written units to support comprehension. And once we understand how this works, it actually makes spelling much more straightforward. It makes our ability to analyze words much more straightforward. Spelling is only confusing if we're not paying attention to morphology. So, why is this word says often thought of as an irregular spelling? It's because we're not bringing morphology into our instruction early enough. As soon as we focus on the morphology before trying to teach children to spell this word, the spelling says changes from a seemingly irregular spelling to a totally logical, systematic, and predictable one. And we can teach the spelling of says structurally very early on as students learn to read and spell the AY digraph that is introduced very early in most phonics sequences. The word say is taught for students to learn to encode and decode that, along with a whole bunch of other words. These are copyrighted. I don't recommend you take them and use them because they're copyrighted, but we can find them on the internet. You could look for them yourselves. This kind of thing shows up all over the place, and this is the kind of thing that we can use as our starting point for teaching the word says. So students are working with that AY digraph. We can just point out that these three words spelled with an AY are all verbs. They're all formed from just a base. We have play, stay, and say. And we can talk about this concept that we put these structures together to form words. And with the ing suffix, we can just say, look, we use that word slightly differently. I play, I am playing. We don't have to expect kids to read and spell that ing suffix to talk about it and to show it to students and say, look, we put these units together. But then fairly early on, we're going to be wanting them to spell says. And at that point, we can just talk about the S suffix. When we're talking about someone else who's not in the conversation, we use that suffix to change the verb. She plays, she stays, she says. And then what do you notice about the pronunciation of those words? And you talk about this with your students. Isn't it interesting that the base in says is pronounced differently than in say, even though it's spelled the same? And the base in plays is pronounced the same in play. But, I guess that we're going to see that kind of change in some words and maybe not some others. As you do this kind of teaching, you are priming students to understand this important fact of the system, that the pronunciation often changes, but the spelling stays the same. And words like says are a perfect way to introduce these concepts, which students are going to see throughout the system. And at this point, I can never resist saying that I got into this field because, as I think Dr. Ehri mentioned, our oldest son is dyslexic. And when he was in 5th grade, he could read pretty well, although there were actually some things going on that we weren't aware of. He needed work on phonemic awareness. He needed work on all kinds of other things. But he'd figured out reading kind of, but he could not spell. And he couldn't spell words like says, does, done, even though he'd seen them so many times. Today, that kid is a mechanical engineer and he understands structure. If I could have told him, if his teachers could have told him back then, oh, hey, that word says, you already know how to read and spell say. All you need to do is add that S and you have the spelling just like you do with plays and stays. He would have had those spellings down. Same thing with does and done and all the ones he couldn't, where he would have gotten those down so quickly. So we may think it makes life easier to wait to introduce morphology, but we need to be really careful about those kinds of assumptions. So getting back to our suffixes, we use S unless we have a reason to use ES. And one reason is when the stem we are adding the suffix to ends in the grapheme Y. And this applies to not only single syllable words, but also words of more than one syllable, where we're adding that ES suffix here, and words where the final Y is pronounced E, as in hurry, carry, copy, as opposed to the I pronunciation in try, cry, fry, and so on. So the same concept is at work in all of these words. And I love the systematic structures that we see on this slide, or in any situation where we look at the morphological structure of words like these and the consistency that's present. The other time we use an ES is after a stem that ends in O, as you see here, with the same concepts at work, the same consistently spelled structural elements that are combining systematically, and that varying pronunciation for some elements, although the spelling doesn't change. And even though the words formed from the base elements do and go are pronounced differently, do and go, the structural patterns in these written forms are ordered and they are consistent. And by the way, I did a talk for the California chapter of the Reading League earlier this year where I explained the O in the spelling of the word do, talked about the word does and every part of it. And I have a link to that recorded webinar on my website in case you're interested in that part of the spelling of the word does. And I'll give you that at the end of I'll show you that information at the end of the website or the end of the webinar, not a website. So the other reason for looking at all words through a morphological lens is because if we don't, we can easily misanalyze phoneme-grapheme relationships. Because it's true that we can teach children to read and spell a word like this, tries, even if we ignore the morphology. But when that happens, our students can't really understand how the graphemes in the word represent the phonemes. Because when we analyze our pronunciation of the word tries, we perceive four phonemes. We've got t, r, I, z. And then when we take that multimorphemic word and try to connect it to its spelling, the job that the T, the R, and the S are doing is very clear. We understand the connection. But what is representing the long I pronunciation, the I in the pronunciation tries? Well, the only thing left in the spelling is the IE, so that must be the grapheme, right? So then we ask kids to remember an IE grapheme in this particular word, even though that's not the most coherent or simple explanation for which grapheme is representing the long I phoneme. Morphological analysis, though, changes our understanding of the phoneme-grapheme relationships in the word tries, because if we start with the base, TRY, it's easy to see that here the long I pronunciation is being spelled by the Y. And that's typical of words formed from a base that end in a grapheme Y, as you see on the right side of the slide. This again is very common, children are taught this. And now we can just notice what happens to that Y when we add our suffix ES. And we see, oh, that Y changes to an I. Yeah, that's the suffixing convention that we've been talking about. So now the I grapheme is spelling the phoneme here, this long I phoneme, just as it does in so many other words. The graphemes Y and I can both represent the same phonemes, and which one we use often depends on where in the word the phoneme appears. Y is often at the end of a word, and I does the same job in the middle of a word, unless we're talking about words of Greek origin, and that's another story, or a separate conversation that we could have with kids. So the grapheme doesn't change when we change try to tries. The grapheme doesn't change from Y to IE. It just changes to I, and then we add the ES. And the S is spelling Z at the end of tries, but then what is that E doing? It's not spelling any part of the pronunciation. This little null or empty set symbol that I put there can be used when there's no physical representation of a phoneme in a pronunciation. And we could go into lots more depth on that. And I'm using this notation rather loosely. But for now, I think it's helpful to show this to represent the fact that there's no perception of a phoneme corresponding to that E when we pronounce or say the word tries. And the matrix also reinforces that the Y or the I, both of those toggling in the base, is quite separate from the E in the suffix, and they are not part of the same grapheme. So we certainly can teach kids to read and spell without paying attention to morphology, but when we do, we overcomplicate the essential phoneme-grapheme relationships that we are teaching them. If instead we teach them to spell the base and apply the suffixing convention then things become very simple and clear. And the reason I'm showing you all this in such detail is that this is only one example of how understanding morphological structures clarifies phoneme-grapheme relationships. This is also true with the spelling of the word tried, which has that very well understood ed suffix at the end. We may be less likely to treat the I followed by E in the word tried as a digraph, but I still see that analysis happening. And when we do that, unfortunately, it obscures the morphology. It requires more memorization by students. They have to remember things that seem random, don't make sense to them, and makes it harder for students to understand the system. So I want to stop and just summarize a few of the concepts that I hope you're noticing. The first is that words have meanings, while written morphemes contribute to the meanings of words, and the orthographic denotation of a written base will connect and contribute to the meanings of all words containing that base, while prefixes and suffixes can both affect meaning and provide grammatical information, sometimes one or the other, sometimes both. And then etymology is an essential tool that allows us to make sense of written words, of written morphology, including the orthographic denotation of a base. And it helps us find words that belong together in a matrix and those that don't. We've also seen that written English words are formed from one or more morphemic elements that can include single syllable words that are multimorphemic. And those elements are spelled and combined consistently, but their pronunciations are going to often vary. So now I want to offer one more perspective on morphology that is really important. And that is that morphology is often thought of as simply additive. We take a word like fasten, we add an ing suffix, we get the word fastening. If we added the ed suffix, we get the word fastened. And that is certainly one aspect of morphology. But morphology is also like an X-ray machine that lets us look inside words. And often it helps us understand, as we've just been talking about, why a particular grapheme, a letter or combination of letters, is used to spell a particular word. And it can show us the connections between the spelling and the meaning of words. And we've seen some examples already, but it's true of so many more words than we realize. The word fasten, for instance, is built from two elements, the base FAST and the suffix EN. This particular EN suffix forms verbs that represent the development, creation, or intensification of a state. And we see examples of that here. So when we soften ice cream, we make it softer. When we darken a room, we make it darker. And when we fasten something, we make it fast. But what does the word fast have to do with fastening something? Again, that might seem completely unrelated, especially for young children, because we think about the word fast, and for most of us, this usage of moving quickly is probably what comes to mind first. But let's look at a matrix for the base element FAST. And here we see that the orthographic denotation I've put in this matrix is firmly fixed, secure, or strong. And when we think about some less common usages of this word, we see that connection really clearly, right? The ship was held fast by the anchor chain. We used color fast fabric. So with that compound color fast, that implies that the color is firmly fixed to that fabric, right? So again, not the definition. You can't just add up the two meanings, but you see the connection. So there's a much closer connection between the orthographic denotation and these two usages, but then what does being a fast runner have to do with being firmly fixed to something? And again, we can look at the history, and there are a couple of possible explanations. One is that a fast runner is a strong runner. Right? That's one way to think about it. We see that strong in the orthographic denotation. But my favorite is that runners may have been described as fast when they were able to stick closely or be firmly fixed to whatever they were chasing. So if you're a fast runner, you're going to stick really closely to a person who's running in front of you, who's maybe a little bit faster. And so knowing this deeper sense is going to help students understand why the word fasten is spelled the way it is, because fastening something is obviously attaching it securely, but it will also help them integrate these multiple meanings of the word fast itself. And without this context, Think about the confusion that might result when a student is reading and comes across a reference to two children being fast friends, or she was fast asleep. What might they think? And we haven't even talked about multilingual students who are still learning English and may not know all the vocabulary that their peers have learned through exposure to spoken English, including idioms and expressions like fast asleep. So this type of study can be really powerful for multilingual learners. We can use morphology and the orthographic denotation of a base element to help develop their vocabularies as well as their spelling. And by the way, I have to tell you another story. I showed this base FAST to a really young student who was really bright and had a fantastic vocabulary, and he had to learn the word fasten as one of his spelling words, but he'd never heard that making something fast could mean attaching it so it wouldn't move. And he got so excited about this that his mom told me later that he went home and he gave his family a riddle. He said, I have a riddle for you. What word means both standing still and moving quickly? He was so engaged with this. And so this can be very engaging and fun for students. And, we may sometimes worry that things that are fun may get in the way of the things that are essential. But sometimes the fun, engaging stuff takes us right to the essential stuff. And that's what we find when we study morphology of a written language with this understanding of how the orthographic denotation of a base is going to connect and contribute to the meanings of all the words containing that base. And of course, it will clarify spelling, because think about trying to spell fasten from its pronunciation alone. My student was really struggling with that. However you pronounce this word, some people pronounce it with a little schwa there, a little neutral vowel. Some people don't even pronounce that at all, just fasten. But however you do that, we can only get part of the spelling. We can get the F, the A, the S, and the N, but we have no idea why the T is there. We're not sure why there's an E rather than maybe an I. We might not even be sure there's a vowel there at all. So the relationship between the spelling and pronunciation is only partially clear when we treat a multimorphemic word like this as though it's just one unit, one written unit. And dividing the word into syllables, by the way, doesn't help. But the spelling of the word fast, formed from that same base element, is 100% clear just from its pronunciation. So it's often helpful to start with the spelling of a word that's formed from just a base, especially when we find those most common phoneme grapheme relationships there, and then assemble the word. In this case, we're going to form that word fasten by adding the en suffix. We know that that's used in lots of other words. And then we can go from spelling back to pronunciation and see what's going on. We can notice that even though we pronounce the T in the word fast, we don't pronounce it in fasten, but it's still there because it's part of that base that is kind of helping us know what the word means. The N is clearly connected back, and however we pronounce that E or not, it's just part of that hopefully consolidated en suffix that's going to show up in so many other words doing the same job and spelled the same way. So I've covered a lot of ground quickly, but I want to show you one more type of base that is really important to know about, and that's a bound base. Pretty much all of the bases that I've been highlighting so far have been free base elements that form words on their own, although you did see that bound base STRUCT when I was first showing you some examples. But I want to show you a couple more bound base elements. This base is DU. And obviously it's bound because there's no word that's spelled DU, at least that I'm aware of. Every now and then I find out that I think something is a bound base and there's maybe an archaic word or a really rare word. So it's always interesting to check in the dictionary, but I don't think there's a word DU. We're going to call this a bound base. But it has this deep sense of two, obviously. So words like dual, duo, and duet, we sense that connection easily. They're formed with just the base and a suffix, and we have some compounds. The word duplex is a compound, du and plex, and then duplicate is also a compound with a suffix added. So as we start working with bound base elements, it becomes this never-ending kind of trail adventure of new discoveries. We find a base attached to the one we're focusing on, and then we're like, what about that base? And we go to learn more about that one. So here you see the base PLICE forming a matrix of its own. And I'm showing you here on this slide the synthesis of the words duplicate or duplicate, quadruplicate, complicated, applicant, implicit, and accomplice. And we could form a lot more words from this matrix, as I'm sure you can see. And I do want to point out that this is a connecting vowel letter U. We haven't talked about connecting vowel letters at all today, but they are present in the spelling of many words in English. So we could spend another whole hour on this matrix and all that we could notice and learn from it, but I just want you to look at the affixes in the matrix and notice that you've seen them all before, or you can think of words where they appear. And then notice how we build these long, complicated words from so many simple, small parts. When you first see this, I know it looks like a lot, but spelling becomes so much more logical when we go deeper into words, because the surface spelling and the shifting pronunciations of the elements in these words obscure the systematic nature of the spelling system. Think about how it would work if you tried to spell these words by breaking them into syllables and then spelling each syllable, working with nothing but its pronunciation. We would get parts of all of these words right, but there would be so many parts of these spellings that students would just have to remember for that one particular word. But the morphology is logical, systematic, and as students consolidate these units, they will be prepared to more deeply understand and more easily learn the new words that they will encounter for the rest of their lives. So we could spend days on bound base elements, but I do need to let you go at some point. I'm looking at the time here, so let's wrap up. So I'm hoping tonight you were able to at least get a sense of how the English system of orthographic morphology is systematic and orderly, how knowledge of this system supports spelling, vocabulary, and comprehension. And we've seen how all words are formed from one or more morphemic elements. Even some single syllable words that we might think of as unitary are actually multimorphemic. They combine systematically, they're spelled consistently, pronunciation may vary. So it's often very hard to spell from just the pronunciation of an isolated word. And I was showing you fast and fasten, and working with different words in a morphological family often clarify the spelling of every element that forms words in that family, because the stress moves around and different elements are stressed and more clear and able to understand. So working with that whole family really helps clarify everything. Words have meanings, morphemes contribute to their meanings. That orthographic denotation is so important, connecting to the meaning of words, and prefixes and suffixes affect meaning and/or grammatical function. And so often, morphology is often viewed as purely additive. I think this is why sometimes we've thought we should just wait on morphology. It can come later, but it also lets us look inside words, and it helps us find those bound bases that are so productive. And its systematic nature is the key to understanding spelling and connecting spelling to meaning. And then etymology. Etymology is often viewed as nice to know, interesting, fun, but not essential. But we can't understand the spelling of every word without morphology, and we can't understand morphology without etymology. And etymology is the key to connecting the spellings of written morphemic elements, which we need to kind of sometimes figure out for ourselves, and then connecting that to the meanings of words. So we're going to wrap up at the very end here by talking for just a couple minutes about instructional implications. So first of all, explicit systematic instruction involves showing students how the system works, as Dr. Ehri mentioned as we got started tonight. But I do understand that what I'm showing you tonight may be a new perspective on morphology for you. And that can be a little bit intimidating. It was definitely intimidating for me when I first got started. And I think it's important to acknowledge that as you begin learning more about the morphology of written language, you will not be able to explain every word your students ask about. And again, I can relate to that because even now, there are so many words I can't explain. yet. But truthfully, it's not necessary to understand and be able to explain the spelling of every word. What's important is knowing that there is an explanation, that spellings are not random, that our spelling system is coherent, and that morphology is the framework of the system. And it provides a firm foundation for learning how to spell and to read and comprehend. We want to show students how the system works and that it's a complex system, but it's completely coherent. So, a really good place to start is with a small set of words that you feel comfortable explaining. Those words will illustrate the concepts, many of the concepts that I just shared with you, and some words are better illustrations than others, but the concepts that I'm talking about, they're they're everywhere in the system. So you will find more and more examples as you start looking. Some of the examples you may want to start with are the words I shared with you tonight. And again, I'm going to send you those matrices. Um, some of these will pop up early in instruction. Some of them are single syllable. Many of them are thought of as irregular if we ignore morphology. And some of them might seem too complex for early learners, but they're so much simpler to learn to spell and read when we bring morphology into the picture. It's also very powerful to use words like jam and draw with multiple meanings, and then those base elements that help us connect to those multiple meanings. And then give yourself permission to learn along with your students. And one of the ways to do that is to create a wonder wall. When a student asks you about a word that you have no idea how to explain, which of course happens to me all the time, you can say, "Wow, that's a great question. I don't know about that. I wonder what's going on there. Let's put that word on the wonder wall and we'll think about it." And then you can decide where to go from there. You can phone a friend, you can email me, you can ask other people who know even more than I do, but I hope you decide to dive into word study, to learn more about working with the matrix and the word sum and etymology as a research tool. And there are many ways to learn more. On my website, you're going to find a link to a lot of links to a lot of resources. I've got a further resources page with free recorded webinars, links to other resources. While we were preparing this talk, Dr. Ehri and I were talking a lot with Pete Bowers. He knows a tremendous amount about all of this and a lot about the research behind this and the research that we hope will be done in the future. So you can go to my website. You'll find also, I mentioned that webinar on does, that's there. There's a bonus chapter for my book that might answer some of the questions that may have come up for you when I talked about just 3 suffixing conventions and these consistently spelled elements. And here's my contact information as well as Dr. Ehri's. So with that, I will thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Ehri. And again, Dr. Ehri, thank you so much for nominating me to give this talk.
Sue, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for your illuminating presentation, introducing us to the morphological analysis of words. I have a question for you.
Okay.
You've spoken about the morphemic analysis of words that beginners learn to read. I'm wondering how you see this as fitting into systematic phonics instruction.
That is a really important question. I appreciate you asking that. So first of all, I am a huge advocate for systematic, explicit, integrated structured literacy teaching, right? And systematic phonics is a big part of that. But I think we need to keep in mind the goal of phonics teaching. Why are we teaching phonics in the first place, right? It's to help kids understand the system, because we don't want kids memorizing words as whole units. We don't want them memorizing morphemes as whole units. They need to understand that phoneme grapheme glue that we've been talking about. And we don't want them to try to read a word by looking at the context, thinking about what would make sense. So we want to teach students to look at every grapheme in a word and use what that grapheme tells them to identify the word, to decode it, whatever we call that, to help them learn that word. So obviously we have to teach, we want to teach those phoneme grapheme relationships and give students lots of practice. But at the same time, we need to be framing that instruction appropriately from the beginning and make sure that kids know that all words are built from these units that are spelled consistently. All the things we talked about tonight. You can, by the way, you can do that before you even start teaching, kids to read and spell. You can do that with oral language. Let's talk about the word play and playing and played and player. Do you notice what's happening with those words? And we can play with words orally. We can use a word like cats and dogs and notice the change in pronunciation and put that s suffix, just so kids start to understand these concepts. And we can certainly bring it in with those irregular words or seemingly irregular words that actually aren't irregular once we look at the morphology. So to integrate this with phonics, we need to bring this larger picture of how the writing system works into our thinking, into our teaching, because written words are not just spoken words written down. And it's often easier to see the relationship between words in the written form. All the things we've talked about tonight, we want to keep that in our minds. And that's why I do a lot of what I do is about helping share this with teachers, because you can't teach what you don't know, and we're all still learning. So it's really all about framing what we do in our phonics teaching in the bigger picture of how the system works.
Okay. Well, that makes sense to me. The more that beginning readers are taught about the systematic nature of word spellings, the easier it will be to remember how to read and spell words. Let me end with a few comments. Sue has described how the writing system captures systematic relationships between subunits in the spellings of words and elements of their pronunciations and meanings. I see this as contributing to the orthographic mapping process, that is, explaining how readers can learn sight words more effectively. Sight word learning involves bonding several identities of words together to form a lexical unit in memory. These identities include spellings, pronunciations, meanings, and syntactic functions of individual words. Orthographic mapping depicts the bonding process, which identifies systematic units of the writing system and connects them to units in pronunciations and meanings to store words in memory. Graphemes and spellings bond to phonemes and pronunciations of words. Morphemic subunits in spellings bond to the pronunciations, meanings, and syntactic identities of words to retain them in memory. In order for bonding to happen, learners need to know and apply these systematic relations when they learn individual words and store them in memory. Explicit instruction is needed to teach these systematic relations. I've portrayed the development of word reading in terms of phases. Much of morphographic development contributes to the consolidated phase with more advanced vocabulary words. However, it doesn't start there, as Sue has pointed out. She's clarified how it begins much earlier to learn even primer level words like does and says, which are typically regarded as irregular. But now you see that there's an underlying system to be taught. In sum, Sue has shown you how the morphemic spelling system works. I would love to see this incorporated into students' reading, spelling, and vocabulary instruction. It would provide a powerful boost to their word learning. I would love to have teachers become curious about morphemic word families, learn about the morphemic writing system, and apply it in their teaching. There is much research showing the involvement of morphology in reading and spelling. Colleagues such as Bill Nagy, Helene Deacon, Peter Bowers, John Kirby, Joanne Carlisle, and Danielle Kohlenbrander, among others, have been studying these relationships. I would love to see more research examining how the explicit teaching of matrices and word sums contributes to sight word reading, spelling, and vocabulary learning. Thank you so much for your attention and interest, and thank you, Sue, for a wonderful presentation.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Linnea. What a fantastic recommendation. I think I speak for all of us when I say thank you so much for taking some time with us tonight. We are all definitely better for it.